As you saw in the last exercise, we were able to very easily create a 3-column layout. One of the problems that we're having with our layout currently is the content is kind of crashing into each other. So we're going to look at how we can use Flexbox to create a 3-column layout. We're going to make it responsive, and we're going to add some margins. The file that we're going to begin with looks like this. So the code that we're using is kind of similar to what we had before. This time I'm using a div with a class of wrapper. I have 3 articles which all have a class of column, and then each unique article has a further class of column 1, column 2, and column 3. And each article contains an H3 and a paragraph of content. The CSS that I'm currently using is just defining some rules for the wrapper, and then I have a general rule for padding on the columns, and then each of the unique columns has its own background color. I also have created a media query, but I don't have any rules within the media query yet. So we'll be working on this so that we can explore some of these other options with Flexbox. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add the display of Flex to our wrapper. And as you saw in the last exercise that we did together, this is going to force our content to be in a 3-column layout. So as soon as I do that, we get the 3-column layout. Now remember, the width of the columns is going to be determined by the width that exists in each column. If I want these columns to be equal width, then I need to go ahead and on each of the columns, or in this case I have a class called column that applies to all of them, I would just use the flex property and add a value of 1. If I add this and refresh, now each of my columns are going to take up equal width. The height by default is going to be determined by the height of the content that exists. And one of the cool things about Flexbox is that the height is going to automatically be equal on all of the children items that are part of the Flex parent. We can adjust this by using the align items property. So for some reason, if you didn't want these to be aligned in the way that they are, we can use align items. And if I set the align items to flex-end and save, you can see when I refresh that now they're going to be as high as they need to be to contain the content that is within them, and they will all align to the baseline of the wrapper. Now, we have some other options here, so we can change this to flex start. And if we use flex start, now they're going to be all aligned to the top of the wrapper. And another option that we have is flex stretch. Flex stretch is going to allow each of the columns to be the same height. This is actually the default value. So if you want your columns to exist like this, you actually don't need to define this since it is the default. Now, if we want to create spacing between our columns, we have a couple ways that we can do this. Normally what you would do is you would probably add a margin on the right. So if I come into my column rule and I add a margin on the right, and let's just say that we make that 15 pixels, and I save, you're going to see that now I have spacing between my columns. The problem with this solution is that each of the columns is going to get the margin on the right. So the last column is not going to appear flush to the right. We have extra spacing. And what we would normally do is we would use a last child selector or something like that, and we would remove the margin on the right. Using Flexbox, though, we don't actually need to utilize this to create the spacing. To create the spacing, we're going to go back to our wrapper, and we're going to apply the justify content. And I'm going to set the justify content to space between. And when I set this to space between, you can see that my columns are going to be equally spaced out. Now, currently, I don't have any spacing in between them, and that's because they are set to fill the parent element. If I want to have spacing between them, I need to use the justify content in conjunction with something called flex basis. This is a way of specifying a particular size. I'm going to go back into my column rule, and I'm going to use the flex basis property. I'm going to set my flex basis value to 30%. Now currently, when we refresh, we don't see any difference, and that's because when you're using the flex basis, you don't need to use the flex rule anymore. Remember that this is telling the child element to take up one equal unit of available space. We no longer want to use this anymore, so I'm just going to comment this rule out. And now if I save and we refresh, you can see that there's no visual change yet. The other thing that I need to change here is I need to tell column 1 to use box sizing. Currently, we're using padding, and remember what happens. When you use padding, it gets added on by default to the overall width. So my flex basis is 30%. I have 3 columns, it's taking up 90%. Plus, I'm using 20 pixels of padding on the right and on the left of each of these. So they are 30% plus an additional 40 pixels each, which probably is going to exceed 100%. If I use the box sizing property though, then the padding and the width of an element is going to allow our math to stay as simple as possible. And what's going to happen is the padding and the border are going to be added to the overall width. So if I say that the width is 100 pixels and I add padding of 20 pixels, the width is still going to be 100 pixels. It's not going to be 140 pixels as it usually is without using border box. If we save now and we refresh, you can see that I get equally sized columns. They're taking up 30% of available space. They have padding around them, and now they have these great looking margins, except that I don't have the margin on the right hand side. So when I'm using this technique, I don't need the flex property. I'm going to use the flex basis property in conjunction with border box if I'm using padding, and generally you'll be using padding, so you probably want to use the box sizing of border box. And then with flex basis, I'm going to use justify content and set it to space between. You have some other options available. The space between is the one that you'll probably use the most, but you also have the option to use flex start. Flex start is going to go ahead and have the spacing appear on the right hand side. We also have flex end, which is going to have the spacing appear on the left hand side, but I find that the most useful one is going to be the space between. The flex start is the default option, so without defining anything, that's what you're going to get. I think you'll find that this technique is a really useful way to create a multi-column layout and to ensure that you get great looking gutters in between your columns. You can easily control the width of the columns and still have the gutters be part of your layout and not have to add a bunch of additional code. The final thing that we want to add into our page is we want to ensure that our page is responsive. Currently, if I resize the page, you can see at a certain point the columns just get too narrow to really be usable. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our media query and we're going to eliminate the 3-column look at a small screen. Currently, the page is not set up in a mobile-friendly manner. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify that we want the 3-column layout to occur when the minimum width is at least at 700 pixels. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my wrapper and I'm going to get rid of the display flex and the space between. The other items aren't going to affect what's happening. So if we just delete those 2 properties and save our page, you're going to see that the page is going to convert into a 1-column vertically stacked layout. Now all I need to do is in my media query is I need to set up a rule for the wrapper and add on the display flex and the justify content space between. If we save now and refresh, at a small screen, a screen size that's 700 pixels or lower, we're going to get our 1-column layout, and as soon as I get to 700 pixels or larger, we're going to jump to our 3-column layout. In this way, we can easily create multiple column layouts and control when and where the columns are going to switch, and ideally optimize for the screen size that the user is viewing the web page at. The code that we need to do this is very minimal, and you can really take advantage of the Flexbox feature so that you can ensure that your web page is built just the way you want it to be.